There we go. And I'm very happy to welcome Richard Walker. He's the director of the Living New Deal. They've reached out to us with information about their project, and it just sounds fascinating. So we're really, really glad that he's able to join us. I'm not sure if he'll mention the fact that he's actually in Burgundy, France. So the miracle of the internet, and we're have a great connection, and we're real happy to have you. So let me just turn it over to you. Thank you, Richard, for joining us.
Well, thank you, Christine and Beth, for inviting me. It's a pleasure to be here. Yeah, it's if I fade halfway through, it's because it's 12:30 a.m. here. So it's an unusual time to be doing a lecture, but I'm feeling perky, so it should be okay. And I have a PowerPoint, so you don't have to look too closely at my bleary eyes. Sorry about the lighting, but I'm in an old house and I forgot to think about the lighting. So I just have a little table lamp here. It's very French. Lousy lighting is a characteristic of French life. Anyway, so I'll just kind of loom at you out of the darkness here. Anyway, very happy to be here. The reason for it is specifically was a map of New Deal Washington, D.C., the Living New Deal, produced last year, or just came out early in 2021. And we've been trying to get people's attention around D.C. for what we've done and to get this into everyone's hands, particularly groups like yours, of people who would appreciate and are interested and appreciate local history and also the peculiarities and contributions of the New Deal. So I'm going to start off here with, let's make sure we get it. There we go. There's my outline. You can see I'm going to talk about us for just a minute so you know who the heck I am, we are, Living New Deal, and then talk about the elements of the New Deal in and across the city. And that should allow me then, whoops, looks like one item is missing. Oh, no, it isn't. No, we're good. Okay, so there we are. We have 5 items here, and I'll try to move along and talk for about 40 minutes. Okay, so to start with us, we've been around for a little over 10 years. We went national about 10 years ago. We started in California under the leadership of Gray Brecken, and I helped take over about then because I had some resources as a professor at UC Berkeley, and because I was a participant in an institute. So that helped us get off the ground, but mostly we operate with private donations and occasional grants here and there. Our purpose is to, first of all, is to map all New Deal public works across the United States. There are literally hundreds of thousands, a couple 100,000 probably out there. We have mapped 16,500, which seems like a lot, but there's a lot more because there's so many. There are big ones like Hoover Dam, and there's, you know, a local sidewalk. So it can be, they're of all scales, and they're everywhere across the country, all 3,000 counties in the United States, states, territories, everywhere. People have very little idea, which is why we exist. And we're trying to educate Americans about the New Deal, what it did, because so much has been forgotten. Some of it, of course, just the passage of time, people have died off. My parents were New Dealers, but and even I'm getting old now, so it's been quite a while. And some of it, of course, has been intentionally erased by a certain kind of politics in the country. And then we try to promote the New Deal lessons for American public policy today. You know, look to the New Deal. It's not an explicitly political program, but it, of course, has to do with enlightened government and for the people to aid the common people and invest in the country. So we feel like, as our founder, Gray Brecken, says, that we're unearthing a lost civilization. You see a few of the high peaks, like the San Francisco Bay Bridge or the or the old terminal at National Airport and so on. But most of it's hidden away. People have forgotten. Some of it has been erased. Some of it was underground to begin with, as we'll see. So it was never documented. So this gives us a reason for being that the New Deal ended so quickly with the war that there were never really adequate final reports of what they did. And when it comes to the New Deal, people know a lot about programs, Social Security they know a bit about, and National Labor Relations Act, that sort of thing. But the kind of scope of public works is something that really is very little understood. Our national map is online. There are a zillion points, as you can see, and as you zoom in, the lower right and the upper left, there you see you're zooming farther and farther. And as you zoom in, then you start to see little icons that tell you what kind of a project is it. Is it an art project or an infrastructure project or what? And then you click on those buttons and up pops a summary of what's there, and you click on that again and you get a full page of what's there and any photographs we have. Of course, we have tens of thousands of photographs on file from all these sites. We have a website that's chock-a-block with information. And we do, news, latest news, what's going on, both in terms of discoveries of old New Deal murals, for example, preservation battles, or, public policy debates that invoke the New Deal. One thing I would want to point out is that we do a lot of New Deal history, and we have summaries. Probably the most popular thing on our website is our summaries of New Deal programs and New Dealers. And we have over 80 programs and laws that were passed under the New Deal, put in motion. People have no idea there were that many. If you ask even well-informed people, they can usually maybe name a half dozen, maybe a dozen New Deal programs, but it's scores actually. And then of course, a lot of our job is to get the word out to people. That's our educational function. We do tours of sites like Rincon Annex there in San Francisco. That's Gray Brecken, telling people about those refrigerated murals. We do exhibits, we do conferences. That was below is a conference on women in the New Deal we did 3 or 4 years ago. We write, we interview with the press. We try to put out social media, though, since we tend to turn the gray-haired, our social media effort could be better. And so we are very active. We do a lot of things to try and get the word out. And one of the things we do is the city map series. So we started with a small one of San Francisco. We then did a big one of New York, which was so successful, we now have a New York chapter of the Living New Deal. So we created this one for Washington. If anybody wants to create a chapter of the New York of Washington Living New Deal, we'll be very happy to help you. So it's pretty much on the same pattern as the New York one, but you have to alter it based on the city because there's so many specificities. We're now working on trying to get funding to do one of Los Angeles. And then after that, Chicago and other big cities. The Washington, D.C. map, like our other maps, here it is. I'll wave it at you. It's a nice little pocket map, put in your purse, your pocket, but it actually folds out to quite a large poster size, 18 by 27 inches. And on it, we map as little dots over 500 New Deal sites, and we feature as larger dots 34 notable sites, which we then explain on the back of the map what they are. And we have an inset map. So I'll give you a look at that. Here's the map itself on the left. Again, it's much bigger than that. Little thumbnail photos of the key sites, text on the back that's easy to read and easy to coordinate with what you see on the front, I think. And this is the top half of the map, so you can see the little dots. We can't specify all 500, and a lot of them are smaller projects like road work or something like that. but or a playground. But the big dots you can see have their little thumbnails and then their explanations on back, and they're all numbered. And then the whole thing is color coded. And so it makes quite a handsome thing, and it's pretty easy to use. The lower part is a walking map that you could use around the mall, because obviously that's the center of monumental and federal DC, and that's where the biggest concentration of New Deal work is. Artworks on the left and other key sites on the right there. So what are the lessons? What am I going to talk about here? It's not just a lot of dots. The maps, we do the maps because they're handy, because people could use them to learn about their own city or be a tourist, as a lot of tourists come to DC and could use this as a guide to go and look at some interesting sites. But more than that, it's also a lesson in history and public policy. The New Deal literally transformed the city, the capital city, which is pretty important, which is why we chose to do Washington. And if you go to almost any county in the United States, you'll run into dozens, scores of New Deal projects that had an enormous impact in the 1930s, not just because the country was in this desperate Great Depression, but because it added so much to the public weal, whether it's local schools, local civic centers, amphitheaters, parks, sewage system, water systems, land preservation, and erosion control, anything you can name practically that was in the public interest to do with public goods, public services, public life, public lands, the New Deal did. It helped complete the 20th century capital city by finishing the Macmillan Plan with the finishing up the Federal Triangle, which had been begun seriously in the late 20s, but then they ran out of money and time. And then by expanding the federal footprint, so you got this major federal office center that the city is now, and also, very importantly, upgrading roads and sewers and water supply and so on, the basic infrastructure that makes this city of now 6 million or so in greater DC function. At the same time, it was about improving the lives of ordinary people by investing in things like parks and recreation, schools and health projects, public housing, and public art and architecture, which I will come back to. And a lot of this was done by the participation of the unemployed themselves, who were doing relief work under the CCC. Well, not so much in DC. We did have the CCC, the WPA, working for contractors that were paid by the PWA and so on. And I will make your head spin with all the classic alphabet soup of the New Deal. There's no way to know exactly how many Washingtonians, but it must have been easily 10,000 were hired to work on these projects. And we have photographic evidence of them at work as well as what they achieved. Okay, so let's get on with the kind of footprint, the imprint of the New Deal on the city. I'll start with buildings and monuments. The federal footprint, the new scale of government, because the New Deal was this huge leap in the impact, the presence, and also the size, managerial size of the federal government, the kind of thing that a certain recent president hated. Civic buildings for DC itself, for the municipal, what was then the DC Commission, the municipal government, which was less independent there, but the New Deal treated it as reasonably independent, and for the city's residents. And then monuments, when we're talking about the monumental capital city of DC, though I have something to say about that too. So start with the federal footprint. These kind of buildings that you're all very familiar with, if you live there, whether they completely gutted the west wing of the White House and rebuilt it underground, above, higher. So the West Wing, as it is known now, is a New Deal project. buildings like the State Department, the Interior Department, the FTC, the second building of the Library of Congress, what's now called the Adams Building, and more. New GSA regional building and la-di-da-di-da, the Social Security building, and more and more. Civic buildings, the DC Municipal Building down in the lower left, which became the cop shop, the Recorder of Deeds building upper center, the couple of big high schools, and I think that's Coolidge High School in the upper left. Four or five buildings on Howard University campus, and the Freeman's Hospital, which was now part of Howard. And there's what's it called? The Rawlings. I can't see it because of my, there we are. Yeah, the J.R. Giddings School, important historically Black school there on Capitol Hill, which they built a whole bunch of additions. I've never been totally sure which part is original and which was added by the New Deal. You can tell me, because you know a lot more about some of this stuff than I do. Whoops. The monuments, actually, they didn't build a lot of monuments to themselves. That's a great thing about the New Deal. But they did clean up monuments. The Washington Monument was in very bad shape when the PWA paid to have it totally refurbished. It's been refurbished again a couple times since. And the Jefferson Memorial was kind of had been bouncing around Congress for a long time, and FDR made it a kind of pet project and got it done. Whatever you may think of Jefferson, I think it's a beautiful building. Or neoclassical building, it's a particularly good example of that. The only monument Roosevelt ever wanted to himself was his centograph. Whoops, was that centograph down at, I can't click on my pages. That was a mistake. There in front of the National Archives. But since, of course, there's now a Roosevelt Memorial down by the river. But I didn't put the mall in this part, but it comes up next. This is a nice transition point because the mall is such a crucial centerpiece to the monumental city, as we know. And so that figures under Parks and Recreation here, because it is a kind of big park open space. Then the Capitol Parks, east and west, and then small parks and playground, which is so important to the daily life of citizens. So the National Mall had been, was it part of the original L'Enfant plan? The Macmillan plan was to really clean it up. And that's what the New Deal actually finished. Again, it started in the 20s. The reflecting pool went in the 20s. But everything from the Washington Monument to the Capitol was completely redone by the WPA with PWA money, CCC workers as well. They re-landscaped all around the Washington Monument. They relayed the road system, the pathways, the lighting, the big lawns, and they cleared out all this stuff that was left over from Civil War, World War I. There were all these buildings, military buildings especially, that have been plopped in the middle of the mall. Also, the Victorian view of what the mall should look like was much more lacy and Olmstedian, and or the first Olmsted. But the second Olmsted and the Macmillan Commission wanted a big, clear view is what we have today, and that was a New Deal product. They spent about $1 million when that was serious money in the 30s. The Capitol Parks, of course, were taken over by order by FDR, gave it to the National Park Service, one of the first things he did, and then they went about assessing and rehabbing the parks. Rock Creek was in pretty bad shape. There was a report at the time, and it got cleaned up. New pathways, new footbridges. The Parkway was already being built. That's part of the Macmillan plan, but the New Deal finished it, finished a number of the bridges over it and of it, and so on. The National Zoo, the New Deal put in 4 or 5 new buildings, sculptures, and landscaping, and so on. Less well known, of course, is the East Side and the giant sort of Anacostia Park complex. Not only Anacostia Park, which is about as big as Rock Creek, but also the Kenilworth Gardens and the National Arboretum. National Arboretum is not part of the park system, but it's right next to it. And it was an agriculture department project, but the CCC laid it out and did the initial landscaping and planting and built the greenhouses and so on. Same with the Kenilworth Gardens, which exists, I guess, a little as a private operation, became public. CCC built most of those, the levees and so on that retain the water so you can have your water lilies. Then they improved the park itself and put in facilities like a swimming pool and so on. And then small parks, really important. They improved upwards of 200 parks and playgrounds across the district, including a couple on Capitol Hill. Marion Park and Folger Park were both improved. Some of those improvements are looking a little worn today, especially at Folger Park. Marion Park is in very good shape, it seems. They also, of course, manned or peopled the playgrounds and the parks for the kids with other WPA workers. So it wasn't just the WPA as manual labor, rebuilding the parks and planning, but actually helping the kids, teaching them and guiding the play activities and so on. They PWA put in serious money to rehab. Okay, I'm blanking on the name of the park down there. Malcolm X Park, which is not called Malcolm X Park officially, over on in the Northwest. They finished up the Great Cascade there, and that's still a very popular park, much used by the locals. And then basic infrastructure. The infrastructure, the kind of boring infrastructure that everybody focuses in on now. I'll say something more about that in a sec. But roads and bridges, waterworks in both water and sewer, and also people don't think about it, but the waterfront and the airport is infrastructure too. So boat, aquatic access and aerial access to the city. So they did a huge amount of road work, which I can't really depict because a lot of it's repaving, sidewalks, expanding a street, grading it, regrading it, and so on. There's a couple 100 miles probably of that work around the city, which we have dots on our map, but it'd really be better if you could have a kind of lines on every bit of mileage they did, but that, unfortunately, we never had enough time to do that. There's that big underpass there that's one sort of spectacular bit of road work. Otherwise, I showed the parkway and then the bridges across Rock Creek. There are P Street Bridge, the Lausanne Legion Bridge, and the Ellington Bridge. That's Calvert Street, right? And Massachusetts Street were finished with money given by the New Deal through the DC government and so on to finish those, to build those. They had been on, these things, as all things of federal government, the plans are on the books long before. It takes a long time, but the New Deal came in with the money and the people and the ambition to do these things, get them done. The waterworks, the basic sewage system in Washington is really owing to the New Deal. They built these huge interceptor sewers and separated sewage from flood waters, and then guided the sewage all the way down to Blue Plains, which didn't exist. So Blue Plains has started. That laboratory building was the original administration building. That pump in the upper left is an original, still there in the pumping building, which is original. They did a little bit of work on the water supply, although most of that predates the New Deal. That's Delacarlia Reservoir, where they did some pumps. But it's really the sewage system, which, Blue Plains is one of the biggest sewage plants in the world now. and handles the entire metropolitan area, more or less. So that's really important because the Potomac and the Anacostia were just sewers. And that brings me to my next point, which is the way we treat rivers and waterfronts, which we take for granted now, but was completely different in the past. These were the waterway of, like the Potomac, or in my case, the San Francisco Bay. They were just freeways. They were equivalent of today's freeways and freeway interchanges. Nobody would think to preserve the East Bay Freeway interchange. Today, one of the busiest in the world. Maybe someday preservationists will say, oh yeah, we should have kept those overpass, some of those clover leaves. But just as we look at them as every day, the old river was every day. Well, the old river got badly silted up over time because of agricultural erosion from the tobacco industry. There were problems for the boats themselves. The Washington Channel and the tidal basin were both cleared out by the Corps of Engineers under the New Deals. The Washington Channel was cleared out, and the Southeast waterfront for the first time was upgraded. The East Potomac Park, which had started already but was expanded, the roadways improved and so on by the WPA at that time. And then on, the Washington Marina was built, and the whole waterfront was turned into something new, which was access for things like ferries, but also and fishing boats, but also for people to enjoy the river, for sailing boats. So part of the marinas along the Washington Channel were meant to be, yachting marinas, pleasure boat marinas. In front of the Lincoln Memorial, when they redid, they didn't build that bridge, but when the Parkway came in and the steps there in front of the Lincoln Memorial, I'm not sure exactly when they were built, but they would park a floating raft a stage built by the WPA would float out in the river, and they would have concerts. Those concerts went on until, I think, well through the 1950s, maybe into the 60s, and were very popular, as that little black and white picture shows. No trace of that anymore that I know of. On the other side of the river, though, there's the airport, of course, which is New Deal, and Roach's Run Sanctuary, which was put in next to it. This idea, of course, wildlife refuges. FDR created over 200 new wildlife refuges. We tend to think of the refuges and Teddy Roosevelt, but FDR was a big bird watcher fan and did a lot for wildlife, particularly bird life in the 30s. Teddy Roosevelt Island, which was redone by the CCC completely it was an old farm. The TR monument itself was put in later. National Airport, I just have to mention it because it got done. They've been debating it, where are we going to put it? They didn't want it right in front of Arlington Cemetery anymore. There was an old field, and then there was a new field, Hoover Field, but those were quickly obsolescent by the 30s. So they needed a new site. FDR personally intervened. Those are the good old days when the government was still small enough that the president could be involved in something that specific, like the Jefferson Memorial or the airport, and they got the job done with Roosevelt breathing down their neck. And the old terminal building, which has been fixed up, that's the original, beautiful, modern building. And then they went and the Republicans named it after Ronald Reagan, which is very ironic since big government was not exactly Ronnie's thing. We shipped Ronnie from California to take over Washington and then the rest of the world. We have a lot to answer for. But ironically, Ronald Reagan's father worked for the WPA as a local supervisor. Dick Cheney's father, another well-known Republican, was in very bad straits when he went to work for the WPA. There's a lot of stories like that. Elvis Presley's father. And finally, I think so important, beyond these kind of investments and big public structures and infrastructures, are what the New Deal felt it was doing for the people. That the whole point, there was a strong, old, progressive, moral, even Christian moral kind of tinge to the New Deal. FDR and ER Eleanor were certainly, had come out of a kind of Christian ethics when they were younger, even if not, church going in particular. And this idea that you were going to serve the people, and of course the people were desperate in the Great Depression, and that's what most attention goes to, talking about the relief work, the relief payments, and getting the economy going. That's what the New Deal was all about. But the New Deal was about a lot more. It was about long-term public investment to modernize the country, upgrade the country, and kind of bring the entire country up to a similar level. So to reach into especially the backward areas of rural America, which were very backward still in the 1930s, and but also in cities, give people a sense of public unity, public life, public beauty, all for the betterment of the citizens of the United States. So I'm going to talk about architecture briefly, art briefly, preservation, and then a note on African Americans. Because your preservation audience, this is going to be really obvious, I'm sorry, so you'll just have to bear with me. But I do think it is important to say that in general, the New Deal's view on public architecture was let 100 flowers bloom, or 1,000, whichever digit how many zeros you want to add there. So they didn't really, we tend to think of and the conservatives in America say, well, what the federal government is big, it must mean they're telling everybody what to do, but they didn't actually. They gave out a lot of money with very few strings, and to do what the locals wanted. And this is less so in DC because it's such a federal, it's a federal city and it's so dominated by the federal government. But there's even here, this is true to a degree, but the architecture was kind of whatever was going, whatever the architects wanted to do, what was in the local plan. So you get everything in the 30s from neoclassical Beaux-Arts kind of monumental buildings to Pueblo post offices in New Mexico and so on. And even the Treasury post office, because Treasury controlled all public buildings at that time through the procurement division, including post offices. And they were more standardized, all those little federal style post offices in the East. But those could vary a lot regionally too. They do, especially in the West. So the major styles you're all familiar with, but they were willing to do, finish up the Federal Triangle, neoclassical, the Jefferson Memorial. These are all, coming out of Chicago 1893 and out of the Beaux-Arts, School of Beaux-Arts in Paris. And of course, Haussmann's Paris is really the model, more even than Burnham, or the model for Burnham becomes the model for civic centers around the country. And so major buildings like finished the IRS and the FTC and the Clinton building, which was the old post office headquarters in the Federal Triangle, were all meant to be done in this Beaux-Arts style. So the New Deal finished most of those buildings, which weren't complete when Roosevelt came into office. But they can't take primary responsibility, except for maybe for some of the newer ones, like the Department of Interior, which was Harold Ickey's baby, the Social Security and Railroad retirement buildings, the first ones to go south of the mall, and so on. And they were done in modern, which, a lot of us love. Modernism's best moment, I like to say. And some of it in DC is really magnificent, whether it's the airport terminal or the interior of the interior building, interior of the Social Security building, the Adams building. There are some absolute beauties there. Some of the detail work is marvelous. Some of the bas-reliefs are marvelous. But they also did, they did a lot of, especially later in the 30s, early modernism, international style comes in. So whether it's a Ford building, which they built for the census of 1940, or the State Department building, which was actually built for the War Department before the New Deal, also built, transition to war, the Pentagon is really a New Deal project. Who knew? That building, that dormitory at Howard University, that's from the 30s, but very modernist and so on. Or the earliest public housing of the 30s was very modernist too. The architect who built the public housing was a great believer. Robinson was a great believer in the beauties and efficacy of modern utilitarianism. But then they, people wanted, and they often did, especially high schools, give us a nice old-fashioned Federalist building, post offices, buildings out at the like Patuxent Research Lab done in this old kind of Federalist style. That marvelous library, Founders Library on Howard campus, the chemistry building, and they rehabbed other buildings and did the landscaping and so on. The public art, of course, is what people maybe most remember about the New Deal's public side, public service, enlightening and pleasing the people. And it really, we have to remember it as a unique moment when the federal government put so much money into public art everywhere, in public buildings, in public spaces. Federal, of course, in DC, it's heavily within the federal buildings, but not all of them. For example, the Recorder of Deeds building has magnificent murals in it, New Deal murals. To pay unemployed and otherwise, and just generally artists, even ones that were employed, to do public commissions en masse, that was something special. And the artists were given very wide license, depending, there were many art programs, and some of them had to go through the Washington, whatever it's called, the Washington Arts Commission or whatever it's called. Others were pretty freelance, actually, in the Federal Art Project, telling local stories, local artists. So again, you got a wide variety, of course, dominated by what social realism, regionalism at the time, popular at the time, but there was a lot of great modern artists who worked for the New Deal, who did some real modern painting here, there, and everywhere. The note on the art that I just have to throw in here is that, of course, a lot of public art today is controversial for good reason, because of the Black Lives Matter movement, because of the reassessment of America's tub-thumping, imperialist, and colonialist and racist past. It's very important for us to reconsider that, and a lot of good thinking is going on, a lot of enlightenment is going on. But at the same time, you get some very hasty denunciations of artworks, including New Deal artworks. Most of them are not objectionable. There are very few, really, because New Deal artists were often social critics in the 30s, because there was a pretty strong left, and artists always tend to be a little going against the current, at least in modern times. And so a lot of what they did was already social criticism. But even so, like we had in San Francisco with the George Washington High School murals, you had a communist artist criticizing George Washington, but now being criticized by sort of extreme anti-historic members of the public who think that it was actually celebrating Washington and imperialism, because their powers, you know, a lot of the public doesn't interpret or understand, or, you know, hasn't had the time or the means to completely understand art. And yet, at the same time, I've seen several post office murals in the, for example, in the post office building that are pretty. There's a couple of you know, savage Indians attacking the post office, which is complete mythology, that are pretty objectionable, and have a couple of them been covered. And that's okay, as long as they don't destroy them. There are things to be done with controversial art, but it's an interesting question. And in the New Deal art case, it isn't just what's in them, though that has to be looked at closely because so much of it does have critical social commentary, but also that New Deal art itself is a historic legacy that is irreplaceable because it reminds us of what could be done in terms of public support, government support for public beauty for everyone. Okay, enough from my process. I stepped down off my soapbox briefly. Beautiful sculptures and bas-reliefs all over the place, like the Lowry doors in the Adams building, the famous anteater at National Zoo. These are all New Deal. The artwork, these are Department of Interior plus one from the post office. I like some wonderful murals. A lot of them very locked away today. Justice Department, you can't get near it. Thank you very much. The combination of 9/11 and more paranoid style of American politics means a lot of the buildings are inaccessible or more difficult. Interior, I'm happy to say, is still very much open for tours and is absolute goldmine of public art. I got to say something about New Deal and preservation, that the New Deal actually plays a big role in the history of American preservation. The Historic American Building Survey was started by the New Deal, and it used WPA labor to do these surveys, plus some, I mean, skilled labor, professional labor, because they hired, as Harry Hopkins put it, you know, white collar workers were unemployed too, artists were unemployed too. They did things like the famous Index of American Design to have artists sketch the work of folk artists all over the United States, and that's in the National Gallery. That's a kind of preservation. That's the Newlands Fountain in Chevy Chase, a little outside the district, but okay, we'll count it. That was restored, repaired by the WPA. The C&O Canal, that was bought by the National Park Service with PWA money, and then rehabbed the first 22 miles by the CCC. The Frederick Douglass home had been bought and saved by private organizations, later became a National Historical Site, but the New Deal paid National Youth Administration workers to go in and organize Frederick Douglass's papers. They did, of course, all that war, you know, they did some of the old wartime forts like Fort DeRussy, just to clear it off so you could see the remnants of it. And of course, lots of Civil War battlefields. That work was really advanced during the New Deal. I do want to say a last word about African Americans in the New Deal, because there's a lot of misinformation around that the New Deal was racist, that it was excluded African Americans. You see this repeated a lot, not just by anti-New Deal people on the right, but by leftist people, progressive people who ought to know better. When actually the New Deal did an enormous amount of good for African Americans, and that's very much in evidence in Washington, D.C. So no, the New Deal did not exclude African Americans. They were in the CCC. It got the first The CCC was actually integrated at first, not in the South, but in the North and especially in the West, in California, the camps were integrated until 1935. And that, by the way, is that was 13 years before the military integrated. The CWA hired Black workers. WPA hired upwards of 2 million of them. PWA, of course, had demanded anti-discrimination in the hiring by contractors, which of course wasn't always enforced, although Harold Ickes was a stickler for enforcement. The National Youth Administration was run by anti-racists, including Mary McLeod Bethune, who ran the African-American or the Negro branch of the NYA. The Resettlement Administration, the Farm Security Administration did a lot for African-Americans in rural areas. The U.S. Housing Administration built public housing for African-Americans, as did PWA, and so on, and so on, and so on. Social Security excluded domestic workers and agricultural workers, did not exclude Blacks per se, but indirectly, because so many were domestic and farm workers, but that was done in all Social Security at the time. All European Social Security excluded domestic and farm workers, and besides which the agricultural sector wanted it. And besides which it was shifted back in 1951, so really the idea Social Security did some great evil to African Americans is just not true. Now, the National Labor Relations Act did expressly exclude farm workers again, domestics, but especially farm workers because of the Southern senators who did not want to disturb the farm labor regime in the South at the time. And the AAA did a lot of harm to Black Southern tenant farmers because it basically favored big farmers and modern farmers and was not very good dealing with, in fact, ignored the small and struggling, who it regarded those as, you know, the detritus of history, which of course has been always true of American agriculture. American agriculture has always been modernizing, has driven out millions and millions of farmers. So what the New Deal, was the New Deal uniquely responsible for that? No, but there it is. The housing, I won't go into detail. I love talking about housing, but I'll just say housing segregation in America starts in the late 19th century. The first racist zoning is in San Francisco in 1860s and 70s, and it's still going on. And to blame that all on the New Deal is a huge mistake, although clearly the FHA policies did a lot of harm to African Americans, of excluding them of effectively through financial evaluations, excluding them from most mortgages in the great post-war boom. So, but here the work relief programs hired literally millions of African Americans, about proportionate to the African American population. They did manual labor, they did skilled work, like that artist there working in the middle at the Recorder of Deeds building. You had CCC, CWA, CCC, Black CCC workers did the work on the C&O Canal, for example. And then that's an NYA carpentry training school program down in the lower right. So the relief work did a lot of good for African Americans in DC. Howard University was massively improved with huge influx of PWA funds, WPA workers, that made the modern Howard University campus, because Ickes, as you may know, was a major figure in the NAACP and he was the guy who desegregated the federal government under, of course, pressure from Black workers in the federal government. Don't get me wrong. It's not like just enlightened white people do all this, but Harold Ickes was quite enlightened on this front. Langston Golf Course was built basically for the sort of Black professional, the Black middle class of DC. was really the first public course. It was the second, but really the first to cater to Black users. That's Joe Lewis playing at Langston Course on the left. And so that's been a fixture of African-American life in the city. Public housing. Hilliard Robinson, shown in lower right, was a Black architect. It was built by Black workers. Yes, it was segregated because DC was completely segregated at the time. And, the New Deal didn't invent that. In some cities, they tried to go against that. And in some cases, they succeeded, like Marin City in San Francisco Bay Area. But that was relatively rare because that's what white America wanted overwhelmingly at every level, was segregated housing. But Hilliard Robinson built the beautiful Langston Terrace dwellings, and also some of the Alley Dwellings Authority in DC built a lot of very decent alley housing to replace shacks across the city. This is before sort of just the mass tear down post-war era that got public housing such a bad name. And I won't go into the details of why that happened, but it had to do basically with the National Real Estate Lobby. And those sculptures at Langston Terrace were built intentionally for Black kids to play on. In fact, we got a comment once on our Langston Terrace site page from a Black lady who had played on that, who's in that picture. So I thought it was pretty cute. Recorder of Deeds building, very important in Black history. The Recorder of Deeds was an African-American position historically and has magnificent murals in it. And I gather it is now being saved after a moment when that picture was taken, when it didn't look good. And hopefully it'll be open to the public again one of these days so people can see all the great murals. I just want to finish on the note, sorry I went a little too long here, that we're making the New Deal visible because nobody can preserve what's invisible and or defend it. Acknowledge that there's a lot of great New Deal architecture. There's a lot of great art, plus there's a vision of public art that I think is really important to think about when we're talking about art preservation. Don't overlook the humble places. The New Deal did a lot of work in humble things, humble sewers and humble roads and humble playgrounds. And a lot of that is still there. Roads tend to be repaved. Sewers, you never know. A lot of them get replaced, but a lot of them are still down there, but it's almost impossible to know. A lot of playgrounds are still there, playground, recreation halls in various parks around the city. I want to say a word about reviving the idea of public works. The word infrastructure was intentionally introduced after the war by engineers and basically by people with a conservative view of public policy, because public work sounds way too good. So if you call it infrastructure, everybody just falls asleep and nobody cares, and you leave it to the engineers, in the sewage plant. But the idea of public works, it is more than just basic infrastructure, but public buildings, public spaces, and all, is an important idea that goes back to the progressive era, and even before that, to the Commonwealth ideas of the early republic. The New Deal did actually aid African Americans to a great degree, and it's an important moment in the early development of the civil rights movement. So be alert, please be alert, you preservationists, to the New Deal. There's a lot of it there to defend and conserve, and a lot of very worthy stuff. And maybe if we had an enlightened government, we would create a new people's army to go out and do a lot of that preservation work, like going through old archives. For example, the National Archives, the Federal National Archives, which were declared as a thing in the late 20s, but then they realized how big a job it was. And not only did the New Deal double the size of the National Archives building by building the interior part, the WPA went out and gathered all the federal records from all the federal agencies all over the country and organized them so they could then be available to the greater public and to historians. So that's my talk. And thank you for listening. And you can always order one of our maps easily from our website, $5, dead cheap. And please come visit our website. And if you get the bug, New Deal bug, you can always submit New Deal project information. We are a crowdsourced project. We even have an app. So thank you very much.
Thank you. This is amazing. Thank you so much for presenting this great, really interesting information. I do have a couple questions in the chat. I don't want to take up too much of your time. I know it's almost 7:30, but what were the reasons anti-New Dealers cited to be against the programs? I assume that was during the, at the time, the people who were against the New Deal.
Well, there's always been a very strong conservative element in America. This is we're basically a business nation, a commercial nation, a highly individualist nation. And the idea of government doing too much has always been anathema. This is a battle goes back to Jefferson versus Hamilton. And through most American history, the Jeffersonians have won, except when wars and disasters strike. And then everybody says, where the hell is the federal government? It should come save us. So that's what the New Deal did. But there was a reaction very quickly. And that was too much government and so on. So there's been a long-term battle to roll back the New Deal, which of course triumphed since the election of Ronald Reagan, declaring the government is the problem, not the solution. Well, Roosevelt felt the government could be the solution for a lot of the problems of a desperate nation, and proved that that was true when capitalism and private enterprise was floundering, was a disaster. But the business world never liked him. Big property owners in the South never really liked it, and they still don't. Talk to Joe Manchin and all those coal mines he owns.
Yeah. Monty, did you have a question? I see your hand raised.
Yes, I have a question. You talked about public art. I was involved in restoring and transferring the mural from the Silver Spring Post Office to the Silver Spring Library to preserve it. Have any of efforts like that taken place here in DC?
Wow, good question. That is I'm glad you did that, by the way. We've got that on our site. We have a lot of, Greater Washington sites too, but DC is what we focused on for this map. And, we did a much more thorough job within the district than we've done in Greater Washington. That has not come to my attention. There's been there's a labeling project, an assessment project that was done in the Clinton building. Sarah Gordon was involved with that. She now works for DC municipal government and has given talks with us. The recorder's building of Dee's building is the one I know as the most sort of closest to being really a disaster for a lot of great art there. Whereas the other federal building, it's not so much that the murals aren't there to be saved and need to be saved, but you can't get at them. Now, there are these debates about covering here and there and certainly better historical marking, which they've done at the Clinton building. I don't think they've done it at the Justice building at all. So what else? The only other it's interesting, there aren't a lot of public murals outside the federal buildings in the district. There's one up at the Mount Pleasant Library, and that seems to be quite intact. And that's the only other one I know, because otherwise you have to go to the suburban post offices.
Thank you.
Are there any other quick questions? You want to take yourself off mute? There was a question earlier, which I'm not, I'm just going to mention, but someone had asked how the New Deal affected Washington, and I think your whole presentation was about that.
Yeah,
So I'm gonna count that as being answered. So with that, I don't hear any of the questions, and I know you've talked for a long time, which is amazing. You've provided some amazing information and really interesting. So
Well, look, if you ever have a question, you can always write me at richardwalker@livingnewdeal.org. And you can
Yeah.
always Google Living New Deal and up pops our website. So you can always find me there. And
Yeah.
happy to answer any questions by email.
Great. Well, thank you so much. And we're so glad that you approached us to want to do a presentation, because I know the people who were able to attend really enjoyed this. And we'll put it on our website. Hopefully the recording worked and technology is with us. My fingers are crossed. And so you can access it there. Again, we will be going on hiatus for a couple months, and our next meeting is Preservation Cafe is going to be in February, middle of February. So thank you, and everyone have a good evening, and thank you again, Richard, for staying up so late in Burgundy, France. We're very jealous.
Any place to give a talk, you know, we professors, that's what we like to do. Thank you for inviting me, and thank you everybody for hanging. And sorry I went a little long, but
Oh, no, not at all. Thank you.
Really fun.
Yep. Thanks.
Good night.
Bye, everybody. Good night.